Chapter 2. So, in Uchdari, we opened the wooden gate and found ourselves in paradise. But we were not given long to admire it, because Mr. Gurdjieff immediately plunged us into a whirlwind of new work. After we had deposited our luggage in the rooms assigned to us, Mr. Gurdjieff gave Zaharov and me the job cleaning out the sheds. There was one for horses and another filled with hay. We had to toss this hay into the loft. It was full of thorns, but we had to thrust our arms deep into it. We did not pay attention to the scratches, however, for the intensity and tempo of the work had been established. Before sunset, the hay was moved. Returning to the house, I saw a tree of beautiful Hungarian plums, which are very sweet and have a pit that comes out easily. A few days earlier, Mr. Gurdjieff had warned us about eating fruit, recommending that we eat pears and not plums. I was sure he meant that we should avoid the fruit bought in the market because it could be contaminated by handling and there was a serious typhoid epidemic in the area, but I felt that fruit which fell from a tree would be safe. The following day, we went about 10 miles with Mr. Gurdjieff to buy live chickens, and on the way back I had to hold them in my hands as there was no blanket. This was another awful job, requiring constant attention, because one or another of the chickens was always struggling to get away, and then, go catch them! I held them by the legs, and very soon my hands were covered with fresh chicken droppings. It was not at all pleasant, and to add to my discomfort, a physical weakness was coming over me. When we got to the house, Mr. Gurdjieff killed and dressed the chickens himself. I was nearby, ready to help him if needed, for I took every opportunity to be with him. During the night, I began to feel quite ill, with a pounding headache and a sort of dysentery, but the next day Mr. Gurdjieff forced me to overlook my illness and to stay on my feet and be active. Much later, when I had recovered, he told me that because of this activity, I had stored up certain forces that had helped me to fight my serious disease. I went with him to bring fruit from Soki that day, and we stayed there for lunch. On the way back, I lay down in the cart. The illness was progressing. Mr. Gurdjieff asked me what was the matter, and I told him how I felt, and that I was trying to connect myself with him in my thoughts. Good, Doma, good, he said. Next day, after a sleepless night, my head burning with fever, my wife saw that it was absolutely necessary to find another house for me nearby. It was really not possible for anyone as ill as I was to stay in a room with only one large bed and no comfort whatsoever, and then we could have with us our maid, Marfausha, who was still in Tuapse. Luckily, my wife found an empty house which belonged to the famous medical professor Botkin, just across the road. It was a wonderful little house, literally submerged in enormous roses, with steps covered with green moss leading to the sea, in a lane lined with cypresses. I was nearly unconscious when we moved in, but I saw those wonderful roses, and for me this paradise of beauty has remained associated ever since with an unbearable headache. There was a caretaker for the property, and soon our maid arrived. I started to lose consciousness, so what followed I gathered from my wife when I regained full consciousness 3 weeks later. Next morning, Mr. Gurdjieff came to visit us, and, seeing that I was much worse, told my wife to take Marfausha and go to buy some provisions while he stayed with me. When they returned, Mr. Gurdjieff was sitting on the veranda, his face as white as his suit, and to the anxious questions of my wife he answered, "Now he sleeps. I have no more fear for his head, but we have to take him to a hospital as we have absolutely nothing here, not even a thermometer. Later you will see that this is important for other reasons also." He said he would go immediately to Soki to find a hospital and take me there later himself. Mr. Gurdjieff left. I woke up and it began. In my delirium, I wanted to run away. I tried to kill my wife with a wine bottle filled with hot water. When she lifted me up in bed, I caught her wrist and almost broke it. At one time, when she went to fetch something in the next room, I was halfway out of the low window and she had literally to drag me back. In the evening, things went from bad to worse, and even Zaharov, together with the caretaker, my wife, and Marfausha, could not hold me down in bed. My wife was in despair, not knowing what to do, and Mr. Gurdjieff did not come. Zaharov kept going out to the road to watch for him, and finally about midnight he returned. I was asleep, but when Mr. Gurdjieff came into my room, I woke up at once and threw myself at him with such unexpected violence that I overturned a table with candles on it, and Mr. Gurdjieff nearly fell down. But the moment he put his hand on my forehead, I became quite peaceful, and although I did not fall asleep again, I was quiet. Mr. Gurdjieff decided that as soon as the sun was up, they would take me to Soki, and that he himself would drive, going very slowly to avoid the bumps. A second carriage was hired for our maid and the luggage. My wife and our maid packed and dressed me. At 5 in the morning, Mr. Gurdjieff arrived with the cart on which he put a mattress so that I could lie on it full length. He carried me and tied me down with a clothesline, my head towards the horses. He drove, and my wife sat at my feet. When I moved, Mr. Gurdjieff said, "Toma, Toma," putting his hand on my forehead, and I would become quiet. But at one time I was so unexpectedly restless that I broke the rope. Slowly we made the 22 miles to Soki. Some of the passersby threw flowers on me, thinking that I was dead, for my lips were blue and I looked quite stiff in my military uniform. Because of the raging epidemic of typhoid, not one of the hospitals in Soki had an empty bed. Mr. Gurdjieff had been able to find a room only in a home for convalescent officers. We did not know yet that I had typhoid. We spent the night there, and in the morning doctors came to visit the patients. After examining me, they told my wife that they could not keep me a moment longer because I had typhoid, which is highly contagious. My wife had to look for another place, but there was none. The situation was desperate until finally one of the doctors located a free bed in a little country hospital several miles from Soki, and we had to take it. It was a tiny hospital, and my bed was in a room with 3 others. Mr. Gurdjieff left as soon as I was installed, but my wife stayed with me. I was bathed immediately to lower my fever and given all necessary treatment. The doctor said he would not allow my wife to stay in the hospital and asked where he could reach her in an emergency. He insisted that there was no room for her, not even anything to sit on, and that in any case he could not permit her to stay in the hospital for contagious diseases. But she was so determined that he left her alone and even put a stool at my bedside. Earlier, Mr. Gurdjieff had urged her to go to a hotel where he had reserved a room for her and get some sleep, for she had not slept for 4 nights. But she remained in the hospital. Much later, Mr. Gurdjieff said that it was then that he had begun to look at her differently. After the medication, I fell into a profound sleep. About 11 at night, the doctor's assistant told my wife that my pulse was too low and I needed an injection of camphor, but that he could not find the doctor, although he had telephoned everywhere. Again, the situation was desperate. The assistant said that he could give me the injection himself if he had camphor. He pointed towards the feeble light in the distance among the trees, which he said was a military hospital where they would certainly have camphor. Since he had no right to leave the hospital, could my wife go and get it? The night was dark, as only nights in the south can be, but she ran. They listened to her at the military hospital, but refused to treat anyone under another doctor's care. Finally, after frantic persuasion, they understood that it was a matter of life and death, and one of the nurses agreed to go herself and administer the injection if she saw that it was really necessary. Of course, she found that it was, and I was saved. In the morning, when the doctor came in, my wife asked him how he could have left without giving the assistant instructions. He answered that he had not expected me to live more than a few hours. This was why he had finally given her permission to stay with me, but from then on he became our friend and did everything he could for us. My wife managed to persuade one of the convalescent patients to move to a hotel room, which she paid for a week in advance, so that we could have a room to ourselves in the hospital and bring our maid to stay with us. It was very important to move me because of the 3 others in the room I shared. One had diphtheria, another scarlet fever, and the third typhoid like me. It was wartime and there were very few sanitary precautions in such a little hospital. There were not even sheets to cover the hay-filled mattresses, and it was almost impossible to buy anything. After a long search, my wife bought some silk from a Chinese street merchant and made sheets and pillowcases. We did not need blankets because it was so hot. Mr. Gurdjieff, Dr. S., and M., one of the pupils who had come from St. Petersburg, visited me. M. spent the night in our room, for Mr. Gurdjieff now insisted that my wife get some sleep after 13 nights of watching over me. I was only semi-conscious and kept asking whether it was night or day, what was the time, and so on, for I could not sleep. Mr. Gurdjieff asked Dr. S. to write a prescription he himself dictated, and then told my wife to go to the pharmacy to get the medicine. When she gave the prescription to the chemist, he looked at it blankly and said that it did not specify any medicine, but just the sugar coating used on pills. She told him to make up the pills just the same. She understood what Mr. Gurdjieff intended, and he laughed when she reported the chemist's comment. But the pills helped me marvelously. I had nightmares continually. One of them was that red musical notes were running through the room and would not leave me in peace. My wife tried to persuade me that there was nothing in the room, but it did not work. Suddenly our maid, Marfosha, said to my wife very reproachfully, "How is it that you don't see them when the room is filled with them?" My wife thought, "Goodness me, now Marfosha is going mad." But Marfosha took her apron in one hand and with the other collected some imaginary things around the room, and she went out and came back telling me that she had thrown all the red notes away, so now I could sleep peacefully. I slept and did not see them any more. A simple peasant woman, who could scarcely read, understood the problem better than my wife. It is interesting to experience the divided state of delirium. In one sense, I knew that there were no red notes, and that Marfosha was pretending they were there, but her clever action quieted me completely. All that I remember from that period is naturally like a dream, and only certain moments come back to me. But I clearly recall how happy I was when Mr. Gurdjieff came to visit me. I always asked him to put his hand on my forehead. Before long, Mr. Gurdjieff went away to an estate near Tuapse. It was very hard for my wife to be left alone with me still so sick. One day, when she returned from shopping, I asked her in a different voice, "Where am I?" And from that moment I began to recover. I was terribly thin and weak, so that she even had to turn me over in my bed, saying that it was like holding a little chicken that was nothing but skin and bones. As it was difficult to buy anything nourishing, my energy came back very slowly, but the morning tea with sugar and 2 biscuits tasted wonderful, and we were happy that I was finally myself again. Further difficulties were looming. One day we received a letter from the manager of my estates. He said that the Bolshevik Revolution had broken out, and, because everything was being confiscated by the Bolshevik party, he was sending us the money we had been receiving monthly for the last time. The same mail brought me a letter from the engineering administration of the White Army, asking what I would like to receive in payment for an invention of mine that had already been accepted and used by the army. What irony! By the time I received this letter, the White Army was no longer in existence, and I certainly would not receive a penny from the Bolsheviks. My wife and I were alone and weary in a little country hospital, not knowing what to do or when I would be able to move. And what of our future? We clung to one idea. Sooner or later we would join Mr. Gurdjieff again. That meant going to Tuapse as soon as I could walk. One day, when I could hardly stand on my feet, my wife returned from the post office with the news that the last train from Sochi to Tuapse would leave in 3 days, because after the summer season, the railway line was usually blocked by rockfalls and avalanches. The doctor warned me to be very careful and not to move quickly, for I was still terribly weak. But we decided to take the last train. My wife went to buy the tickets and to reserve the seats so that I would be able to lie down, but it was not possible. Finally, the post office staff promised her that they would make me a bed of mail bags in the mail car if only we would be there at 5 in the morning before the public arrived at the station. We were certainly there on time, and I was even carried into the car by the postman. There I could stretch out. These were among the many good people who helped us. In Tuapse we went to a hotel and luckily got the last room, but it had only one bed. What a wonderful sensation it was for me to lie on a real bed, a clean bed. Although my wife and Marfausha had to sleep on the floor, they too felt as if they were in a palace. The next day we located Mr. Gurdjieff, and he advised us to go to Essentuki as soon as I was able to travel. We had friends there and would find doctors and the medicines I needed. So in a few days we left for Essentuki. That journey was a nightmare. We had to change trains twice. We left Tuapse in a roomy compartment, but when our train reached Armavir, our first transfer station, it developed that the train to Mineralny Vodi was crammed with soldiers. There were no first class cars, and everything was in complete chaos. I thought that my being an officer might only make things worse for us, but luckily there was a very kind woman soldier in the crowd who helped by ordering some soldiers to get up and let this sick comrade have a seat. 9 of us were crowded into that compartment, and my wife and Marfusha had to stand in the corridor, which was jammed with passengers and luggage. We reached Mineralny Voda after dark, and there we had to wait 3 hours for the train to Essentuki. My wife and Marfausha managed to fix a bed for me on a bench at the station. They covered me with my wife's mink coat, for the nights were now cold. When we finally reached Essentuki in the morning, we faced a familiar problem. No rooms in any no rooms in any hotel, because everybody who could manage it had arrived from Petrograd. We somehow managed to find a room in a private house. My military leave was over long ago, so officials could ask to see my papers. Now we realized how wise Mr. Gurdjieff had been to insist on my going to a hospital. My hospital papers stating that, having had typhoid, I now suffered from a weakened heart and needed 6 months' rest. 1 year later, with these same papers, I would be released from military service by a commission in Essentuki. I could then burn my uniform and become a civilian and a musician again. I kept only my sword. My wife and Marfusha finally found a tiny house in the back garden of a property where the front house was occupied by the owner. Beyond our house in the garden were empty stables. Still further back, an unfinished, typically Caucasian, 2-story house, with all the rooms giving onto a veranda. Although as yet this house had no windows or doors, it was as if it had been waiting for us, and not only for us, because when Mr. Gurdjieff came to Essentuki, he founded the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man in the unfinished house. Meanwhile, we began to live a peaceful life after so many difficult months. The thought of Mr. Gurdjieff and his plans never left us. Was he going to Persia, or would he stay in the Caucasus? In a few weeks, a postcard from him arrived, saying that he would like to come to Essentuki and asking if we could find a place for him. In another day or two, we received a letter in which he enclosed 1,000 rubles, still a large sum since inflation had not set in, saying that he sent the money in case we needed it. We were deeply touched by his thoughtfulness. Later, the same day, we were happily surprised to see Mr. Gurdjieff standing at our door. For the next few nights, he slept on the sofa in our tiny living room. He liked the place. The owner gave him a big room in his own house, with the right to use the kitchen. Several days later, Mr. Gurdjieff's wife arrived, and soon afterwards, Dr. S. I thought that interesting philosophical talks would begin now, but nothing of the sort happened. We just went for walks every day with Mr. Gurdjieff to the center of Essentuki. He bought sunflower seeds, always giving me a handful, and would spit out the shells in front of passerby. Not a word was said about philosophy, and I, impatient, walked at his side, not knowing how to ask a question. He often came to see us in the evening, and sometimes Dr. S. came with him. Then, at last, the conversations became interesting. One evening, Mr. Gurdjieff spoke at great length about the lack of precision in our language, how we are unable to transmit an idea or philosophical concept accurately, scarcely, indeed, to communicate at all with each other. Later, Mr. Uspensky developed this idea wonderfully, underlining the fact that our language is based on associative thinking, each word being colored by all kinds of individual and subjective images, sensations, and thoughts. His exact transmission of Mr. Gurdjieff's ideas is all the more admirable in that during the Moscow and Petrograd period, we were categorically forbidden to take any notes whatsoever. Later, in Essentuki and Tiflis, however, Mr. Gurdjieff told us to write down what was said by him, or to fulfill a writing task that he would give us, as, for instance, to find a suitable name for the Institute and define its aim. This was a real head-breaking job, which thoroughly brought home to us the conversations with him about the inexactitude of language. The most interesting thing was that during this long search for possible definitions, our inner work was creating within us a taste for exact language. Even though we could not achieve it, at least we acquired an understanding that there are ideas, thoughts, and sensations which are almost impossible to put into words. One evening, just before leaving our little house, Mr. Gurdjieff said quite casually, "This is the last evening I will come to you because I shall soon begin to work with Dr. S." God alone knows how much these words hurt me. I thought he was about to begin extremely important esoteric work with Dr. S, and that I would not be included because I was still very young in the work. All the next day I had no peace, and when I could bear it no longer, I told Mr. Gurdjieff how sad I was that I could not take part in the new work. "Why sad? You have to catch up," was his answer. When a vivid confrontation such as this one occurred, the mask fell from his face, and I felt the deep inner bond already established with him, a bond that grew stronger with the years. It was never a hypnotic tie, because all Mr. Gurdjieff's teaching leads men towards being free of suggestion. The inner tie, let us call it a magnetic tie, was an invisible bond with Mr. Gurdjieff, who was the person nearest to one, in the true sense of the word. It was as if one then saw the real Mr. Gurdjieff, with whom one wished to stay forever. This was not the everyday Mr. Gurdjieff, who was sometimes agreeable, sometimes very disagreeable, a man one often wished to run away from, and with whom one stayed only because one's own work depended on it. I recall that Mr. Gurdjieff once said that the soul, which has to be awakened in us, will be connected with the physical body by a magnetic bond. Through his work with us, he temporarily took the place of our soul, and so a magnetic bond had to be formed with him, which we recognized, and which produced this feeling of nearness. One morning, when I passed through the center of Essentuki, I noticed a poster advertising a special evening at the social club, and had the desire to sit peacefully in the corner watching people dance. Later in the day, when I walked with Mr. Gurdjieff and Dr. S, I spoke of this quite casually. "Doctor, you hear? He's inviting us to go to the club this evening. What? Will you invite us for supper? Let's go, doctor. Thank you for your invitation." This was bad. A supper during the inflation cost a tremendous amount of money, and I no longer had any money coming in each month. But there was nothing for it but to go ahead with this plan, because I hadn't the courage to say no. That evening I took 500 rubles. In former times, a supper in the best restaurant would come to no more than 2.5 rubles. Wow. And went to the club. It was almost empty. There were no dancing, and only the restaurant was open. Now my hell began. Mr. Gurdjieff played with me as if I were a child to whom he wished to teach a lesson. "Well, doctor, since he's treating us, come on. It would be nice to start with some vodka and hors d'oeuvres. Then later it went on and on. I vividly remember to this day the oranges he ordered, because then I knew that my 500 rubles would never pay the bill. I did not have the courage to tell Mr. Gurdjieff I didn't have enough money and ask him to lend me some until we got home. How could I get out of this situation? It was agonizing. Finally, I decided to tip the waiter and send him to my wife for more money. She was frightened when a stranger knocked at our door in the night, but finally the money was brought and I paid for everything. The bill came to about 1,000 rubles, enough for us to live on for half a month. Next morning, Mr. Gurdjieff came to see us and gave me the money I had spent on the supper. This was another extremely painful moment, not from the ordinary point of view, but because I realized that I did not know how to behave like a grown-up man. Mr. Gurdjieff had told me so several times, but only now did I believe it. That morning, Mr. Gurdjieff was not at all as he had been the evening before. There were no reproaches, no raillery. All he said was that what had happened had been done for my sake. Life went on. The owner finished the house at the end of the garden. Furniture began to arrive. Soon the house was livable. Mr. Gurdjieff had written to his people, who were still in Petrograd and Moscow, telling them that everyone who wished to work could come to him in Essentuki.